All right, let's go ahead and get started. I'll pray for us. Father, I pray that you give us a great discussion today as we look at details in the text. I pray that you give us an inquisitive mind, and Lord, if there's an interpretive strategy that you want us to have, I pray that you help us see it today. And I pray in all of it that we'll think more highly of your word and you and what Christ has done. And I pray at the end of the day that he'll be glorified. And we pray all this in Christ's name. Amen. So let me ask kind of a weird question. How old does the Bible say the earth is? Or another way to say that, does the Bible say how old the earth is? What do you think? Yes, no, stupid question? What do you think?
It doesn't give us an exact number, but it seems like we can add up these generations far enough back, although we may have encountered one or two gaps.
Yeah, I mean, there are dates given, and those dates invite us to add them up. Of course, there's a question in that. When you add those dates up, you get a relatively recent number. We're going to see what that number is, but let's just say 6,000 or so years. And when we go to an observatory and look at the universe, what we see in any direction is 13.7, 13.8 billion light years. So who knows if the universe is bigger than that, but when you talk about 27 billion years in any direction, the number 6,000, to put that in perspective, if 13.7 billion years is 24 hours, so any direction we look, 13.7, 13.8 billion years, if you assume that the creation of the world happened at that moment, if that length of time is 24 hours, the Bible is putting the creation of the world at 0.4 seconds before midnight. That's how different 6,000 years is from 13.7, and that's just in one direction. If you look in another direction, so you're talking about half that, 0.2 tenths of a second before midnight, when the visible light would suggest a radically older age. So at the very end of this talk, we're going to come back to that point and say, well, what do we do? But we're going to look at, does the Bible have a basic chronology? Does the Bible have a basic structure? Now, if someone came to our class and asked you the question and said, in one sentence, tell me what Old Testament lit, BIB 222, what has this class been about? Everything that we've looked at in this class, how would you summarize that in one sentence? And don't say homework. What has this class been about? How would you summarize this class? Daniel?
One way to say it would be everything the Bible was written for a reason. many, if not all of the time, we're able to understand. We're supposed to at least search for the answer.
Right, and what's the main point of all the stories that we've seen? What do all the stories point to, Abigail?
This class talks a lot about how the whole Bible is connected to each other, and the main character is Jesus, and how everything we study points back to Christ.
Right. This class has been a Christocentric approach to Old Testament hermeneutics. How does Christ bring all the stories in the Bible together? Would you grant me the assertion that chronology and structure would be very difficult to orient toward the person of Jesus? Would you stipulate that up front? Like, whatever all this problem stuff is, it would be hard to find Jesus in that. Would you grant me that? So we found some easy places where it's easy to see Jesus in Genesis 22 and the Passover. Would you grant me that the structure of the Bible and the chronology of the Bible, that it would be hard to do that? And here's my point. I have friends in science, and they tell me in science there's a thing called parsimony. And that is when you have a theory, and that theory explains not just one thing, but it explains lots of things. When I come to the Old Testament scriptures, for me, it's not just the easy things that point to Christ, but in fact, even the difficult things point to Christ. And we've seen, like Christ and genocide, Christ and the Bible's picture of women. We've seen over and over how Christ makes all those things beautiful. Well, perhaps one of the most difficult things and one of the most boring things, I dare say that against the Bible, but I mean, doesn't it seem that way, that when you come to these numbers and dates and all that, can I get a witness there? Do you just skip over it? It's like, okay, that just is meaningless. So what I want to do today is an experiment to see, can a Christocentric approach to the Bible even bring light to these difficult things of structure and chronology? And my position will be that yes, it can. So, in the Old Testament, there is a feature, and if I can just pull it up in BibleWorks, there's a feature that starts in Genesis 2:4, I guess it is. It says, "These are the generations of the heavens and the earth when they were created." And in Hebrew, there's a strange phrase called Ele Toledoth. These are the Toledoth of the heavens and the earth. And that word Toledoth is weird because we don't really know exactly how to translate it. It's related to the Hebrew word yeled, and my mnemonic device from 30-something years ago is that when a woman has a baby, she yeleds, and that's what yeled mean. It means to like bring forth a child. A woman conceives and yeleds a son, and a toledoth or a daughter. And a toledoth is like the noun version of that. So this is the stuff that such and such produced. And the way these phrases, Ele Toledoth, usually translated, these are the generations of, but it means something like this is what so-and-so produced. The way it usually works is you have the person introduced, or a fact about the person introduced, and then the Toledoth tells you how that played out. So this is the first one in the Bible, Ele Toledoth. these are the generations of the heavens and the earth. And the result of God creating is that Adam and Eve are there and they choose to sin against God. So you have the introduction of the story in 1 to 2, 3. And then this is what that produced, Ela Toledoth. We have one in Genesis 5:1. This is the book of the Toledoth. And it's the generations of mankind. You have long lists there. You have a third one, Ela Toledoth Noah. Noah finds grace in God's eyes. What's the result of that grace? The result is Noah's a righteous man, perfect in his generation. So when you read through the Hebrew Bible, 13 times you come across this phrase, Ela Toledoth, or similar. 10 of those are in Genesis. So 10 times in Genesis you have the Ela Toledoth, and then 3 times elsewhere you have it. So this is what it looks like. These are the Toledoth, heavens and the earth, Toledoth of Adam, Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, Shem, Terah, Ishmael, Isaac, Esau, the Edomites, Jacob, Aaron, Perez, and then we'll look at the New Testament one, Jesus. When you look at that list, what strikes you about that list? There's something that just jumps off the page to me about that list, but what strikes you about that list?
For Abraham or David.
There's not one for Abraham, and there's not one for David. Now, in both those cases, you do have a forefather mentioned. So here with Terah is Abraham's father, but you would think if these structures are so significant, it is odd that you don't have a Ela Toledoth Abraham, Ela Toledoth David. That's odd. What else is odd? It's odd to me why you have like the Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and then Shem, Esau, and then 8 verses later, you have Esau repeated. That seems odd. Is that really one Toledoth? Do you really just have 12 Toledoths in the Old Testament and that one's picking itself up? When you have a Toledoth given, like Ishmael and Isaac, or Esau and Jacob, what do you notice about that Toledoth in terms of who's mentioned where?
The oldest is mentioned first.
Oldest is mentioned first, or you could argue that the worst one is mentioned first. Ishmael is mentioned before Isaac. Esau is mentioned before Jacob. Perez, which is the last Toledoth, in Ruth, is David's line. So you just like Terah's, but it is odd that you don't have Abraham or David having a Toledoth. Now, I know you don't read Hebrew, but can you see how similar that structure is? Just even glancing at it is like, okay, something's going on in the text. And what do you notice about this is the book of the Toledoth in terms of here? What do you recognize? It's like some kind of ring composition, right? This is the book of Adam, and this is the Toledoth of whoever this person is. Now, if we do it in Greek, you see the same structures there, right? This is the book of the Genesis of Adam. And do you find it odd then that the New Testament begins Biblos Genesis Jesus Christus? Do you see how that's presenting Jesus as the 14th Toledoth, or however you want to imagine that? So it's interesting, is it not, that even this Toledoth structure finds its resolution in the person of Jesus. And who's listed first? The bad one or the good one? The bad one is listed first, and notice who's the first priest mentioned? It's the Aaronic priest. Well, is there another priest in the Bible? Is Jesus called a high priest according to Melchizedek? What about the king who comes from Perez? Are those good kings who get people back to the land flowing with milk and honey, or are all those kings problematic kings? Well, they're problematic. And then you realize what the Toledoth is presenting is a list of the prophets, priests, and kings, and even of creation itself. And yet every single one of those Toledoth resolves itself in the person of Jesus. That Jesus is the new Adam. He is the new creation. He is God who existed forever, but he takes to himself, being conceived by the Virgin Mary, he takes to himself becoming the high priest. He takes to himself becoming the new Davidic king. That's why David is anointed king when he's 30 years old. Jesus is baptized when he's 30 years old. Ezekiel becomes a prophet when he's 30 years old. Ezekiel sees the heavens split open. Jesus, when he's baptized, sees the heavens split open. According to Old Testament law, you became a priest when you were 30 years old, and you became a priest by being washed by a Levite, just the way the Levite Moses washes Aaron, and he becomes the high priest. And of course, John the Baptist is a Levite. And John the Baptist, when Jesus is 30 years old, we're told by Luke, what does he do? He washes Jesus in baptism. And so you see that Jesus is becoming the perfect prophet, priest, and king, and all of it is coalescing, and even the source of new creation. So that he's not only prophet, priest, and king, he's new Adam. Now that's very interesting, is it not, in that the primary governing structure in the Pentateuch is Ella Toledoth blank. And when you go through the linguistic data, you find the resolution in Ella, or Ze Sefer Toledoth Jesus. This is the book of the generation of Jesus. So what do you find interesting about that? And do you see how, the person is introduced, and then you have and it's like the whole Old Testament is introducing the person of Jesus. And what is it then that this person produces? Well, it's the New Testament. It's the Ella Toledoth Jesus, who is the perfect Adam, who is the perfect lawgiver, who is the perfect conqueror, who is the perfect priest, who is the perfect Elijah, Elisha, perfect Ezekiel, perfect Son of Man, who creates this new woman who then becomes perfectly obedient to God. And the two of them will be the power couple then who loves God enough to actually follow what God says forever. And because that's true, they're never kicked out of the Garden of Eden, the heavenly Garden of Eden. Any observations or any, I don't know, what do you think about all that? There's never another Ella Toledoth. When Jesus comes, he's the final one. Good, very good. So would you grant me that the Ella Toledoth points to Jesus? That's a great case. And yet we don't really see it, do we? Because we never are looking for it. We just come to Matthew and say, oh, book of the generations. Oh, that's nice. And we don't realize, oh, this is a structure that was set up in the Old Testament, actually pointing forward to Jesus. Okay, so what about this second one? What about this chronology one? Now, let me just get a show of hands. How many of you, when you read chronological stuff, it just warms your heart and it just makes you want to go out and love God and just serve God, and you say, oh my goodness, I did my quiet time this morning and it was number after number after number, and oh my goodness, God just taught me great stuff. No witnesses? Well, that's pretty much all of us, isn't it? Because we come to these chapters and it's like, okay, I know the Bible means something. I know the Bible is significant. But when I come to these numbers, it's like I just don't get it. And so this is what I'm going to do. I'm just going to skip over it. Okay, can I get a witness there? Like you go into the genealogies, you go into Leviticus, you go into Numbers, and it's just like, okay, I'm going to read through this, but the sooner I get through, the better, and I'm done for a whole year. I don't have to go back and look at that. I think that's what every single person who finds who's ever come to it. But if the principle, and what I'm trying to argue for, is that there's a Christocentric approach to the entire Bible, then perhaps there's a Christocentric reason for these numbers. So what we need to do is just look at some stuff. Okay, so that's what I propose we do. We have about 30 minutes. 20 minutes of this is going to be pretty boring. Okay, just going to stipulate that up front. We're just walking through a museum. We're just looking at stuff. We're going to walk through a boring hallway. But when we get to the end of that hallway, we might turn around and look back and see something that just makes our mouth fall open. So give me 20 minutes benefit of the doubt, and let's see where it takes us. So does the Bible give an age for the earth? Okay. I know that people debate this. I'm certain that the Bible gives a date for the creation of Adam. Okay, so I'm not going to quibble about the creation of the world to Adam. I think if we had another day, we could look at that, and I think it does connect the two. But for right now, I'm only talking about Adam. Does the Old Testament give a date for Adam? And if you go through and read, this is what the Old Testament gives. It gives what's called the Anno Mundi dates for creation. And what is an Anno Mundi date? It's a creation from the date of the world. So it doesn't say Adam was created, 5,000 BC or 4,000 BC or 10,000 BC. What it does is assume that Adam's created at year 0, and then it gives you dates from that creation. And everybody who's ever done it gets these same numbers. So I'm just reading through it, saying that Adam is born in year 0. He fathers Seth at year 130. After 130 lives 800, and so he dies when he's 930 years. We just read through nobody's going to get different dates. I am adjusting this date, and many people adjust this date, and we're going to look at why, but it's a 2-year adjustment. So maybe the adjustment's right, maybe the adjustment's wrong, but other than that, these dates, you just read through with a pencil, you just put it in the chart, everybody's going to get these numbers. Well, what that means is you can tell that, for instance, Adam lives basically the first 1,000 years, and shortly after Adam dies, Noah is born. Noah lives basically 1,000 years. Shortly after Noah dies, Abraham's born. So when you go through, you just take the numbers at face value. Because 2 links are being given, there's no way to get a gap between those. So-and-so was born this year, so-and-so years later he fathered. I mean, if you're talking about a gap, it's hard for you to get that second number. And all of these first 20-something names, have the 2 numbers and show you. Just go through, and this is going to be the chart that everybody gets. And it goes from Adam all the way to Joseph, who dies 2,369 years after Adam's created. And granted, you may have a 2-year adjustment here, you may have a 60-year adjustment here, and it's how you put 2 different verses together, but somewhere you're going to be within 62 years of this number, no matter how you add it up. You just come to the numbers, and that's the year you're going to be given. Now, the problem with this chart, and I told you when we walked through this hall, did I not? I told you that 20 minutes were going to be boring. So have I told you the truth, right? Have I lived up to the boring part? Well, these are the numbers. These are what you get. But that number doesn't give us what number Adam was created, because we need to have a BC number. All we know is the gap from Adam to Joseph's death. So how do we convert these numbers to BC numbers? And this is how everybody does it. Well, before we show the conversion, this is when they're born. The light blue line is when they start fathering children. The red line is when they leave this earth. What do you notice about that graph? What do you find interesting about that graph? Yeah, Enoch only spends 365 years on earth, and then God takes him. Everybody else is pretty much living basically 1,000 years until you get to until you get to Noah. You do have kind of a funny thing here, and when you're parents, you'll laugh at this. You won't laugh now, but when you're parents, you'll laugh. The sooner you have kids, the sooner you die. It's like if you wait to have kids, you live longer. I'm not sure what to make of that. Jared waits really long and he lives really long. Methuselah waits really long. It's easier being parents when you're a little older. You're not kind of hung up on, you're 25 years old, you're hung up about everything. You don't know how to be you're 40, 50 years old. It's like, oh, I don't care. It's easy to parent those kids when you're older. And it's funny to me that this graph kind of plays that out. This is that same graph all the way to Joseph. What do you notice about this graph? Yeah, so basically you have this nosedive from 1,000 years to Joseph is 110 years. You're still fathering children, but your longevity goes way down. And notice the event that causes that is probably Noah's flood. From Noah's flood, 10 generations, you just have this massive nosedive. And maybe it's the harsh conditions with the recovery of the flood. The other thing that's interesting is if this is when Abraham dies, right? This is when Abraham dies. Who's still alive in Abraham's life? For the vast majority of Abraham's life. Shem. A person who had gone through the flood on the ark was alive for the majority of Abraham's life. So the fact that he and his father Terah were idolaters, what's significant to you about that? I mean, here you have a living voice who says there's one God. He is serious about this sin thing. Worship him and you'll get grace. Don't worship him and you'll get judgment. And Abraham and Terah, with that living voice, decided to worship foreign gods. That's significant. The other thing that's significant is that the flood is in year 1656 after creation, Anno Mundi year. And look what year Methuselah dies. 1656. Methuselah died in the year of the flood. That's interesting. So, adding up these numbers, yes, it's boring, but there may be a reason. There may be a reason for it. And I've got this all in a document. I'll put it in the Dropbox. Feel free to. The document's 50 pages, and it's kind of this lecture, but written out with footnotes. But all the stuff there, feel free to use it. When you do that, you get stuff like this. What do you notice about this? Isn't it interesting you have two sets of 10 people and then 3 sons, and one of those sons is chosen? Do you see how that points to some kind of structure in the... Now, would you see that structure if you just read through, or do you have to get a pencil and a piece of paper? You have to get a pencil and a piece of paper, but when you take the time to look at it, you realize, hey, there might be something here. I think there might be something with the numbers, okay? Let's see where it takes us. So how do we convert Anno Mundi years to BC years? How do we take that chart with those numbers everybody gets and take them from 0 to 1369 or 2369 and turn those into BC years? And this is how everybody does it. We know from outside sources that the temple was built in 966 BC. The temple was built by Solomon in 966 BC. That date is the foundation stone for every chronological date that anybody gives in the Old Testament. It was built in 966, and so people will work back from that date and convert these dates. we're told that the Exodus happened 480 years before the building of the temple. So we're told that in 1 Kings 6:1. In the 480th year, after the people of Israel came out of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign, in the month of Ziv, which is the 2nd month, he began to build the house of the Lord. 1 Kings 6:1. We know from outside sources that 966 BC. So if it's 480 years before, the Exodus would be 1446. Do you see how that works? So you're just assuming you've established 966, and you're just doing what the Bible said. It's 480 years before that. We're told that the time the people of Israel lived in Egypt was 430 years. So, and that they went out on the very day, right? On the 430th day. So if that's true, when would they have gone to Egypt? Right. So what year would that be? BC year. Add 430 to 1446, 1876 BC. So that's what you do. The building of the temple is 966. The Exodus is 1446. Jacob's 130th year is 1876. If Jacob's 130th year is 1876, then you can convert every one of those numbers, because we know what Jacob's 130th year was from Adam. And so when you do that, you get the Anno Mundi chart, you can convert it. So 2298 is Jacob's 130th year, and if 2298 is 1876 BC, then the creation of Adam is 4,174 years. So that gets my vote. I mean, that's how you do the thing. You add the numbers up, 4,174. There's some quibbles that people have. You know, is 1876 really Jacob's 130th year? Or is it when the Egyptian Ishmael began to persecute Isaac? So if you call that, then you're going to move this up about 170 plus years. And a lot of people do that. So Luther he moved it up to Abraham's 75th. And so instead of 4,174, he got 3,959. But you're only talking 170 years difference, basically, or 200 and something years difference. And when you go and look at everybody's estimate, that's what you see. It's somewhere in that 200-year range. There are 4 decisions you have to make, and based on how you do the 4 decisions, it's going to depend, but it's going to put you within 200 years. Paul adds some things that might point to that 3,959 year being right. I don't know which one's right. I've added up many times. I get 4,174, but I think my adding up is wrong. I think Bishop Usher got it right. I think 404 is the right year. I just can't find my mistake. I'm 170 years off, and I can't find where, but I think he's right, and here's why. What year did David become king in Jerusalem? Or sorry, that's a stupid question. How long was David king? Do you know how long David was king? He lived 70 years. He was king 40 years. He became king when he was 30. He died when he was 70. Not all of those years did he live in Jerusalem. He only lived in Jerusalem 33 of those years. For 7 years, he was king in Hebron. Now, if 966, and we're about to get out of the boring part and turn around and look at something beautiful, okay? If 966 is Solomon's 4th year, what year did David die? 970. David died in 970. Turns out we're going to have to adjust that 1 year because you assume the throne, but 971 is the date everybody's going to say for David's death. Okay, if David's death was in 971, what year did he become king in Jerusalem? If he was king in Jerusalem for 33 years. 1004. He became king in Jerusalem in 1004 BC. Now, what year does Bishop Ussher think the creation of the world happened? 4004. So, in terms of elegance, what do you get with Ussher's? Right. So, basically 3,000 years after God created the world, David became king in Jerusalem. That's pretty cool. And then 30 years later, he died. 33 years later, he died. And then 3.5 years after that, or something like that, Solomon built the temple. Well, I'm pushing it a little bit there, but look at this. If Ussher is right, 3,000 years after the world was created, you have David becoming king. 1,000 years after David becomes king, Jesus is born. Jesus is born in 4 BC, and a lot of people say, well, why do you say he's born in 4 BC? We know he's born in 4 BC because he was born when Herod the Great was alive, because Herod the Great tried to kill him. Herod the Great died in 4 BC. Somebody says, well, why is it 4 BC? It's 4 BC because there was a man named Dennis the Short. He was a monk and he was short. And the Pope asked him to figure what year Christ was born, and he came up with a year, and he was short 4 years. So not only was he short, but he was short in his calculation. But Jesus was born in 4 BC. Well, what year did Jesus die on the cross? Different people say different things. Very good case can be made for 30 AD. If Jesus died in 30 AD, and remember there's no year 0, it goes from 1 BC to 1 AD, then Jesus would have been born 1,000 years after David became king in Jerusalem. What also would be true? Jesus died exactly 1,000 years after David died. If Jesus is born in 4 BC and Ussher is right, then what year is Jesus born chronologically? 4,000 years. 4 years after David dies, the temple's built. Do you know what happens 3.5 years after Jesus died on the cross? Stephen is stoned. And what happened when Stephen was stoned in terms of the church? And is the church God's temple? So, basically 1,000 years from when the temple is being built, God is building a temple of people. Now, we don't have time to go into this, but you know that whole 70 weeks thing, 490 years? People count that all different ways, 445 and, a gap. And did you know that some people count it this way? That the decree happened in, I would put it as 456. And I would put this as 26. That's when Jesus started his ministry, 3.5 years. Midway through, he died. 3.5 years later, you have the gospel to the Gentiles. That's awfully close to this meta-narrative elegance of maybe these dates are important, and maybe it's because we read it and we assume it's gibberish and we never write it down that we miss turning around, looking down the hall and seeing this glorious, man is created on the 6th day. Jesus dies on the 6th day. Light shines forth on a Sunday. Jesus shines forth from the tomb on a Sunday. The law is given on a Sunday. The new law is given on. And it seems to me that you start giving God the benefit of the doubt. You start looking for the elegance. And it starts jumping out on the page. On every page. Even something as boring as that. But God did it in a way where if you assume it's meaningless, it's going to be meaningless. But the moment you assume it might mean something and you start looking, this thing pops out and you realize there may be some kind of elegance there. So I hope you have a great weekend, and I'll see you on Monday.